Oh my goodness, the time has come. Very special guest. You have a program, so I'm not going to surprise you. You already know what this means. Our next presenter brings an insatiable curiosity coupled with an academic's approach to finding basic truths behind every story. He's got a diverse and deep knowledge of world history, esoteric thought and beliefs, monetary systems, and world banking, as well as first-hand knowledge of the Middle East and Islamic culture. He grew up in the film world, to say the least, acting in many of his father Oliver Stone's films, right? Yeah. Becoming a director in his own right with Greystone Park. His television credits include co-hosting the third season of the TV series Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura. He also currently hosts the online show Buzzsaw. So, let's just give a really warm welcome to Sean Stone.
Very cool. All right. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Anarchapulco? Are you sure you can hear me? Welcome, everybody. All right, so what should we talk about today? I think, for me, a good place to start is just to introduce who I am. This is, I'm getting the echo. This is me as a child, as a young tyke, in the film JFK, which I'm sure many of you have seen. And for me, from my perspective, 7 years old, watching the story of Kennedy's assassination being revealed in a courtroom, I think this is really what started my journey, my curiosity into understanding what this world is really about. I always say that JFK's assassination is the gateway drug to understanding the nature of our reality, the nature of power, who really is in power. Because too many times, especially in any of these movements, people point to politics. They say, well, it's the government has the power. But if the government has the power, who in the government? We would think the president has all this power, but the president, as we saw, was viciously murdered practically on television in 1963, the last public assassination, but since then we know that there have been all kinds of silent coups that take place internally. So it begs the question, what is the real power on this planet? One of the things I always like about the Kennedy assassination is that it really points us to the birth of conspiracy theory. And I know you guys are probably conspiracy theorists, and I don't have to get too much into it, but it's an important point to make that in '67, the CIA was so concerned about the US population because 46% of the population at the time in '67 did not believe Oswald acted alone in killing Kennedy. So they worked very hard to provide material for countering and discrediting the claims of so-called conspiracy theorists. And they employed in propaganda assets to answer and refute the attacks of their critics. So they created something many of us know now called Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird, as far as Carl Bernstein, a very famous reporter, noted, over 400 journalists were on CIA payroll through the 60s and 70s. Now imagine we're living in a world where, again, we're talking about power here. Power from the government, power from the media. Who creates the perceptions of our reality? Well, by and large, as we know, mainstream media. Not because we watch mainstream media, but unfortunately, when you're going through any airport or you're talking to your relatives, what do they tend to quote? Fox News, CNN. But the problem is, we have to explain to these people, look, the media has consolidated over the course of our own lifetimes. In '83, right before I was born, 90% of America's media was owned by, 90 corporations? Now, it's down to 6 companies owning about 80 to 90% of our media, and that's in 2011. I think it's actually consolidated probably further in the last 8 years from the major media perspective. So it's very important for us to have these kind of facts when we talk to people about explaining to them why is it that when we're trying to deliver facts to anyone, we don't really know what is a fact, because all we know is spin. All we know on television is not a real event. We know that how movies are made. The same thing with news. It's cast on green screens nowadays with journalists standing there pretending that they're in Iraq or in some foreign country. They recreate the news every day, whether it's the Syrian war, right? At one moment, the Russians and Assad are the bad guys, and then that means Al-Qaeda, who yesterday were our enemies, are actually our allies in the war against Assad. And then, wait a minute, when people start calling that out, they say, okay, don't worry about that, focus on ISIS now. ISIS is the new terror group, right? And never mind that the Russians and Assad are actually fighting against ISIS and Al-Qaeda because they're still the enemies. So you see, it's all spin. It's not about facts, it's not about reality, it's about shaping reality. And this is to give you a little perspective when arguing with people about why they cannot rely upon these mainstream sources. They have to look, as we all do, to alternative sources, to history, to disentangling the realities that are being spun and crafted for us at every moment of our existence. For me, this is, by the way, this is the chart of the media consolidation down to these companies, 6 companies. To me, one of the major things that I studied in college, because I was very interested in power. Okay, government has some level of power, as we know. They can make you pay taxes. Okay, there's laws and all this. There's media has power. Media spins things. We all believe the spin and the hype and the stories that are being woven for us, that we live by someone else's narrative constantly. We very rarely actually know our own narrative of who we are, let alone our country, let alone our human species. But this concept of a new world order was very interesting to me because I'd read G. Edward Griffin's book, I'd heard the term, but I actually found that the New World Order was a term used by the British Empire at the end of its existence, because the British Empire actually still exists. It's called the Commonwealth now. It's more benevolent that way. But when the British Empire was coming to sort of the end, the close of its rule across the planet in the 1920s and 30s, and they realized they didn't have the money to finance military operations the same way that America realized after Vietnam, we can't really subsidize a massive military presence on another continent for a decade or two. The British Empire had the same problem. So they said, how are we going to create a new world order? Which is to say, how are we going to order the planet in a new way? Using legal structures, using transnational corporations and financial institutions, right? A centralization of financial power. So what's interesting to me is the Swiss Federal Institute in 2012 put out a report saying the network of corporate global control is actually 147 companies who control 40% of global wealth. Think about that. People talking about conspiracies, like that's just so hard to fathom, all these people getting together. 147 companies with 40% of global wealth, that's not many people to get together if you look at the interlocking boards and who are actually sitting on these boards and who are actually invested in these corporations, right? Banks like Barclays and Goldman and JP Morgan and UBS and Deutsche Bank and Bank of New York and Morgan Stanley. Just because you're an investor in it doesn't mean you have any stake as a shareholder or any influence as a voting member or something like that. So the centralization of the US banks led to, as we know, the too big to fail, too big to jail era. Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall, basically separating commercial from investment banking. So once they took that apart, now our own depositors' money, as we know, is now tied up with these banks. That's why they're too big to fail and too big to jail, because once they collapse, the entire system goes down. So what we've seen is basically a conglomeration of wealth to the point where they put this out, I think last year or 2 years ago, the eight men are richer than half of the planet. Is that an insane statistic to think about in this day and age, in the 21st century, when we're supposed to be moving towards freedom, democracy, enlightenment? How is it that 8 people have as much wealth as half of the planet? That's about, what, 3.5 billion people? But that's not to say that these are necessarily the real rulers, because as we know, there's how many trillions of dollars hidden away in offshore accounts belonging to the ruling families, whether it's Rockefeller, Rothschild, Crown Royal families, ancient Venetian bloodlines, the various families around the old oligarchies of the black nobility of Rome, names that everyone touts in conspiracy lore. And it's not even that we necessarily have to know we don't have to know who they are to understand how this thing has functioned. It's always been oligarchy on this planet, at least as far as recorded history is concerned, right? The nature of recorded history has been about empires consolidating wealth into fewer and fewer hands in basically an enslavement process of the people. At one time it was physical slavery, now it's debt slavery. But the irony is there are actually more slaves today than ever in history, and yet no one's fighting a civil war about it. We like to say in America that we fought a civil war to free the slaves, but why is it that we're not fighting a war to free these slaves? Look at the map of the globe of right now, how many 20 to 30 million slaves in the world today, probably more if you're really counting, but we're talking about slave labor, people that are literally being forced into labor, people that are being forced into sex slavery, that are being trafficked against their will across borders, sometimes consensually, as we know. But the point is that overall we have a globe that actually has seen the gap increase between the first and the third world since 1960, when some of you would have been just children. We're now, the first world is now 33 times richer. I'm sorry, at the 1960, the first world was 33 times richer than the third world. Now, the first world is 134 times richer than the third world in our lifetime. And we're supposed to be alleviating poverty. We're supposed to be giving charity to Africa. We're supposed to be giving charity to the rest of the world. What kind of scams are we really running here? Let's be honest. So we are moving really toward increasing slavery, not freedom. And slavery of an economic nature. Now, the irony of these two maps is that if we look at the slaves of the world and we look at the colonial empires, they're pretty much the same territories. Going back to the whole point that it's always been an imperial system of empire. The New World Order exists. It wasn't ever a conspiracy theory, it was a conspiracy reality, and it's actually come to completion, and we are now living in it. So, the irony, of course, is that America has played an unwilling, sometimes unwilling, oftentimes co-opted role. I don't want to get too much into detail because time is scarce, but just to give a sense of the work that I put into my book, New World Order, which I would urge all of you to read to get a better understanding of how the United States was co-opted from its principles of liberty towards the British modality of perpetual empire, perpetual slavery based on Anglo-Saxon race, rules, language, right? Cecil Rhodes is one of the great forefathers of this empire. He created his round table. It was inherited by the Milner Group. Things like the Council on Foreign Relations were spawned from that. The Council on Foreign Relations spawned the Trilateral Commission, the United Nations, Bilderberg, Club of Rome, Royal Institute of International Affairs, and others that are interlocking. They may not necessarily have the secrecy around them now. They've been outed, exposed, but the idea of these networks existing, of people gathering together, even at Davos, and essentially a collection of very elite people that think that because they own as much wealth as half the planet, that they have the right to dictate the terms to the rest of the planet. This ideology is an imperial mindset that's been in place, and it was foisted on America because the First World War happened. If you ever want to talk about the problem of war, go back to the First World War and ask someone why America got involved in the First World War and why on the side of the British. And I guarantee you, no one can really answer it for you. They'll talk and they'll say, well, it was the sinking of the Lusitania that brought us in and blah, blah, blah. No, there was a few factors. One, America was always going to side with the British because the British imperial system financially has been tied to the United States since the Revolution. Since the end of the Revolution, and especially since the end of the 1812 war, that blue blood faction of the Northeast and also of the slave owners of the South have always been tied to the British financial model, which is basically buy cheap, sell dear. Take from slaves. The British supported the South during the Civil War. They wanted slavery. Why? Because the slaves grew the cotton that was then manufactured in Britain, sold to the Indians in exchange for opium that was then sold to the Chinese for silver. The only people that profited from that trade was the British Empire. None of the people in the process. So why America gets into the First World War, J.P. Morgan, a British bank, is owed debts by the British. If the British lose the war, they're going to default on their debts. So naturally America joins on the side of the British. There are many other factors, but the point is America joining the British Empire was already the death knell of the American Republic. The American people had no business. We were German, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, Black, Latin, Mexican, you name it. We are a mixture of so many different races. What business did we have fighting for European empires? Both the empires, German, French, British, Spanish. What business did America have fighting for empires? So ever since then, we've been on trajectories of perpetual war. And by the way, ever since the First World War, who has been one of the major instruments of selling war, ironically, has been Hollywood. And if you want to learn more about that, I did a documentary called Hollywood DC. You can check it out on YouTube. And basically from the point of the First World War, when the government approached the most famous entertainers in America, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, the whole United Artists crew, they basically said, listen, we need to promote the war because Americans aren't buying it. Americans are German, Americans are Irish. They don't like the British Empire. You got to sell the war. You got to sell the American people on rallying to be patriotic. And so ever since that point, the propaganda machine began in the United States, and as we've seen, it continued through the Second World War, it continued through Vietnam, it continues to the very moment of, I don't even know who we're fighting anymore, but I guess we're still in a war on terror. By the way, the First World War is very important for an important reason. I'm sure many of you have seen the documentary From Freedom to Fascism by Aaron Russo, but if you haven't seen it, you need to watch it. This is one of the most important documentaries for any American to understand. The income tax is unconstitutional. It was forced upon the American people essentially in conjunction with the creation of the Federal Reserve. And Edward Griffin's here. I'm sure he'll get more into it than I can even discuss. But essentially, the notion of the Federal Reserve System, a central banking system, to finance a perpetual war state. The only way you could sustain that is if you're taxing the American people, and that's really where we are at this moment. 100 years later, everything has been created by the modality of the 1913 to 1919 process of America becoming an empire perpetuated in war that perpetuates slavery through debt, through income tax, and not just income tax, as we know, our entire system that is now in place to essentially put the middle class into poverty and debt slavery. If you want more on this subject, A Century of War is a documentary that I did. A Century of War is on Amazon, iTunes, you can check it out, but it gets into this history, this lineage of the destruction of the middle class, and what is this system of warfare that really, it's a parasite, I believe, that's been ongoing. So, just to give a little insight into this overall open conspiracy. The irony is, people say conspiracy theorists, they love to use that word, but how about H.G. Wells, one of the most famous writers that you're supposed to probably read at some point in your elementary school or high school education, right? He wrote The Time Machine. This is someone who was a major advocate for the British Empire. And what he said in the open conspiracy was that the objective of the open conspiracy would be socialization of international control on raw materials, centralized world banking system, a world Pax, a world economic control, and a restrained population. Basically, he sums up the entire notion of all these agendas of trying to basically consolidate power. I remember reading an article once from a very famous, well, he wasn't famous, but he was a very powerful individual within the insurance sector. And he goes, why should the Brazilians have any notion of sovereignty over their territory? Let's say they're sitting on top of the Amazon. That doesn't belong to them. That's just an accident of history. When I was working on the New World Order book, that's exactly the mentality of the imperialist elite. It's not the fact that the Arabs are sitting on oil, that they have any sovereignty over that oil. That's just an accident of history. It belongs to those in power. It belongs to the imperialists. And their agenda has always been consolidation of that power, as we see. I want to talk a little bit, because this notion of corporatocracy, corporate control, does take me back to something more galactic in scope. Not everybody will necessarily believe it, but everyone has to come to their own understanding of history and galactic history at some point. At some point, you have to ask yourselves, how are we as humans on this planet? What are we doing here? Is it simply governments, corporations, people in charge, or is there potentially something more powerful, something more alien, if you want to call it, that's a parasite, that's parasitic at least in its nature, that is feeding on the energy of souls, that is basically indoctrinating people across time and space? Why is it we talk about empires, the formation of humans across these last few thousands years of history? Is that the natural order of things? How has it become this way? And I think those who study galactic history at some point have to come to these questions about some level of invasion of this planet, some level of invasion of the human consciousness, some level of tampering with human DNA, with mining of the human brain, with turning humans into slaves. If you read the Anunnaki texts, for example, that have been interpreted over time, it's very interesting how the notion of aliens coming here to use humans as slaves or redesigning humans to be their slaves is very much the belief system of that Sumerian culture. And it was belief system then of Babylon. It would then be the belief system of every civilization thereafter who was built atop the remnants of the previous civilization. Perhaps some would argue, and I think in my soul I believe this is true, we are the inheritors of a galactic empire. I would cite Orion as a very important place to look. And a galactic empire that essentially looks to feed upon human, not just human, but all energy forms, that basically looks to the pyramid structures of power as opposed to the more circular nature of power. It's like what Tesla described many years ago when he was doing his research into free energy, and he said, listen, the notion of rockets is very masculine energy. It's an explosion, it's an ejaculation. It only lasts for a short burst. It will ultimately rocket right back down to Earth. The notion of vortical energy is much more sustaining. It's basically the energy that moves salmon upstream. It's the energy that when people see UFOs and other ships in the sky, they're operating on this vortical energy because it's much more peaceful, because it exchanges like the yin-yang process, and it's a perpetual exchange of energy. And it's the same way that our societies are supposed to be organized. Not from top down or to be the base for a pyramid and we, the people below, basically are supporting that pyramid above us, but actually more circular forms of power where we empower each other, and in empowering each other are in turn empowered by our friends and allies that we make along the way. The issue of aliens, by the way, I just want to point out, goes back to JFK, because there have been documents that have come out in more recent years about JFK and UFOs. This memo was from November 12th, '63, and references Kennedy's joint program with the Soviets for joint space and lunar exploration. But the question even of Marilyn's murder then came up with this document from '62, August 3rd. The CIA document refers to her saying she has secrets to tell arising from her trysts with the President and the Attorney General. One such secret mentions the visit by the President at a secret air base for the purpose of inspecting things from outer space. Subject, Marilyn, repeatedly called the Attorney General, who was Bobby Kennedy, and complained about the way she was being ignored by the President and his brother. Subject threatened to hold a press conference and would tell all. Very interesting memos that have come out over the years. My thinking and theory on these things is like, why wasn't this information necessarily discussed? Why weren't UFOs so readily discussed in 1963 and 67? Why wasn't it the right time? At that point, we had a certain understanding of Kennedy, and it developed over the years. At one level, we realized that the mafia was involved. At one level, we realized that the Pentagon was involved because they didn't want to lose the Vietnam War that Kennedy would have withdrawn from. At one level, we understood the CIA was involved because their power was threatened. Alan Dulles had been removed. The CIA obviously is very cryptic and feels like it has to control every president. Didn't feel like they could control Kennedy. They were also very staked in Vietnam. So all these different power structures, the Federal Reserve came up in later years of research. The Federal Reserve itself may have been threatened by Kennedy's desire to print money from the Treasury, the same way that Lincoln had with the greenbacks during the Civil War. So these different issues of power came up over the years, but what's interesting to me is that the UFO issue has come up in more recent years around the Kennedy assassination, perhaps because human consciousness is finally coming to a place that we are ready to actually see something. It's as though the old saying is, what is old is new again. It's like whatever is, it doesn't matter. New is only a relative term. News is only relative to your consciousness. If I know from the very moment that the Kennedy assassination occurred, everything that happened, and my consciousness is far from beyond yours, because perhaps in 1963, let's say I was standing there and I could see all the events of the next 50 years. I could see the expansion of the American empire. I could see 9/11. I could see all these events, and I tried to explain that to somebody. They would throw me in a mental hospital. Human consciousness can only arrive at the moment it is, which is now, in the present. At each moment that we receive new information, our consciousness expands. It reaches a new revelation. And now we're at, I believe, post-2012, a moment when we can start to discuss things like the alien presence on Earth, even to the point that the Pentagon puts out videos of UFOs. And I talked to some people, and they said, I never heard that. Their consciousness wasn't ready. But it's okay, because mass consciousness is shifting regardless of mainstream media's manipulation and all the games of Hollywood. Consciousness is shifting, and it is ready. We are now ready to know these things. The Pentagon admitting that they were running secret UFO programs with my friend Robert Bigelow, who I interviewed on Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura, if any of you guys caught the show. And Bigelow's an interesting character. He worked with the Pentagon. This is his Bigelow Aerospace, by the way. Gotta love the gray alien logo. And Bigelow told me, he said, listen, I would never divulge what we're studying. He was studying aliens at the Skinwalker Ranch, it's called, out in Utah. It's a very mysterious place. The Native Americans, who understood these things quite well, by the way, understood the nature of sightings. They didn't call them UFOs. They had different names for them. Every culture, every consciousness has different terminologies. But they understood that there were beings that were not from this earth moving through this plane of existence. And at Skinwalker, as they called it, Bigelow set up camp. And he's brought scientists from around the world to study there. And when I asked him, I said, well, are you ever going to divulge, or would you ever consider divulging all that you've learned in your studies? You know, you've spent this money, what do you want to do with this information? He said, I'll never divulge it. So he must, I would assume he's divulging it to the Pentagon, who he's got to deal with in terms of their research of the phenomenon of what is extra-dimensional, interdimensional beings, unidentified flying objects, you name it. By the way, this gets us to the question of missing trillions. We're talking, last night, Dr. Paul talked about $120 trillion of debt or something, 100 some trillion dollars. It doesn't even matter anymore, right? What's $1 trillion? Well, a few trillion are missing from the Pentagon, as we've discovered over the years. That was even announced by Rumsfeld the day before 9/11, saying at least 2 trillion were missing. I think now it's been admitted at 8.5 trillion, it says up there. If you ask Catherine Austin Fitts, the former Dillon Reed investment banker and Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Bush the father, Catherine says that there's maybe up to $40 trillion that's been siphoned off. Where does it go? Black budget projects like the secret space program? I mean, Gary McKinnon, I'm sure some of you have heard about, he certainly saw something when he hacked NASA, and he hacked, I think it was NASA, and I think it was one other Galactic space site, basically, one of the government's star fleets. So he basically saw all kinds of craft on his computer, and then he got shut down. Obama was trying to get him extradited from England for many years. Thankfully, it seems that he's doing okay, and he's still not been in prison for what he found out. But again, it does beg this question of secret space programs, UFO working groups. But again, it's always a question of where is human consciousness. Post-2012, we're in a different place. In the 1980s, you could have read this book, Out There, by Howard Blum. He was a New York Times journalist who discovered a secret UFO working group under the Pentagon Defense Intelligence Agency back in the 80s, and people laughed at him. Seymour Hersh. Seymour Hersh is one of the most famous investigative journalists of all. He basically confirmed the group's existence, and he said, these guys are as nuts as you are. Go look into it, have fun, because how do you actually convey this to people that are not ready to listen? You end up writing these books, and years later, hopefully, it starts to piece together, and you start to thread together all kinds of a new narrative, a new story that has to be told about the human existence on this planet, and that maybe we weren't even not only are we not the only conscious, let's say, highly evolved conscious life form here, we probably weren't even the first. Sands of Time, another great book that I would recommend to anyone, but because of time, I won't get too much into detail, but it's a great fun read, ties together the US secret space program with the end of the Nazi space program at the end of the Second World War. Greystone Park, if you're interested in something more along the lines of what is the interdimensional presence of our mind and how we interact with the invisible world, I made this film based on my experiences breaking into this haunted mental hospital in New Jersey. Now everyone knows New Jersey's haunted. It's known for mafia, garbage, hauntings, ghosts, and Princeton University, I think. That's all Jersey is really known for. And the revolution, but we forgot about that a long time ago. But anyway, so Jersey held this mental hospital, and I used to go there, and we were exploring, and basically we came to this realization that we have to stop thinking about an external reality. We have to stop thinking about UFOs and government and anything that's external to us. To my revelation was, it's actually everything is an expression of you and your own mind and your own manifestation. So to me, the most important takeaway is, whatever your focus is, if you place your focus in fear, you will manifest that fear. If you focus in fear, you'll manifest anger, hatred, basically a world that is increasingly bleak, which is where the mainstream media and those that control our perceptions of reality have consistently pushed us towards. They want us to be in a war on terror. They want us to live in perpetual terror. They want us to live in perpetual slavery. As we start to shift our modality and our own mindset and our own being, and we start to move our consciousness towards more love, towards more exploration of possibility, to the notion that the impossible is very possible. It's very real. It's all around us. In fact, only the impossible is possible. That's why we're here. If we can shift our mentality to abundance, joy, happiness, we will recreate the earth. We will create a new modality post-2012, and that's the most important message that I can give you today. And just for anyone that wants to do, we're doing some breath work, myself and my girlfriend. We do breath work, which is basically like a holotropic experience. It's very much like a plant medicine, but it's all based in your own breath. So it's a deep meditation. We're going to do it for about an hour. After this, we're going to walk over to the grass, and anyone's welcome that would like to do it. It's like a voluntary donation as you like, but essentially it's a really powerful experience. So I'd urge anyone that has the time now to come on and join us. And thank you so much for listening.